My name is Matthew Ricketson. I am a Professor of Communication at Deakin University, and it's my pleasure here this morning in Australia, that is, to interview Lesley Blume, who's over in Los Angeles in the United States. I'm interviewing her as she is the author of a new book that's just come out called Fallout, which is about the making of John Hersey's Hiroshima. And I'm doing this on behalf of the Contemporary History Research Group at Deakin University. And so we're going to have a discussion about Lesley's book. So I will start off by asking you, Lesley, where did the idea come from for you to do this book?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me here for the discussion. I really wanted to have my next nonfiction book be a story about a historical newsroom that really documented for readers, that would really document for readers the importance of free press and democracy and in holding the powerful to account. And I know that sounds lofty, but it's hand on heart honest on my part, because here in the States where I am, I'm based in Los Angeles. I mean, for the last four and a half years, our free press has been under unprecedented assault from the top levels of the government, from our president. We've been dubbed enemies of the people. And it just seems, and not only that, as you know, I mean, the press is in a crisis of, advertising revenues are absolutely crumbling. I mean, small newsrooms are disappearing by the raftful. I mean, it's a really perilous time for the press landscape, and it's equally a perilous time to be without an independent press, for God's sake. Yeah. So I've always had an affinity for World War II narratives, but my academic research is always geared more towards the European theater, and I was trying desperately to find this journalistic story. Couldn't find it. And one night, my husband, who's also a journalist and a First Amendment attorney for journalists, said to me, I wonder how journalists covered the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And for us, it was a logistical question. Whoever controls the ground controls the story. And General MacArthur's occupation forces really covered the ground there. And so how on earth would reporters have gotten in and told the story? And I realized that, not as much ink had been spilled documenting how the story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were told to the world as you would think. And then I came across the story of John Hersey and how he really got the blockbuster story of what it had been like to be on the receiving end of nuclear attack in Hiroshima, and that it had taken him an entire year. It had taken a full year for a full press account to come out. And so when I dove into that, I realized that I had the story that I needed, because for an entire year, the U.S. government and occupation forces there had been able to downplay and suppress the story of true nuclear aftermath there. And John Hersey had been able to reveal it to the world. And if that's not a story that demonstrates the power of a free press, I don't know what is.
Sure. Okay. So let's just go back to the end of the Second World War, because it is the dropping of the first atomic bomb at Hiroshima, and then 3 days later at Nagasaki in Japan, that does bring about the end of the war. And there's a whole debate among historians, as you would know, about whether that was a justified military decision or not. It's a separate matter for us right now. But what did the American government and the American military tell people about what had happened? Because at the time, the bomb was dropped and no one was there, so to speak. No American journalist was there right on the day to say, this is what happened. How did the news come out? And then what happens from, what are the American people told to begin with?
So, at first it seems that the U.S. government is almost ecstatically reporting on the bomb. And, Harry Truman makes his announce, and, this is the biggest weapon that's ever been used in the history of human warfare. It draws its power from, the fire of the sun. I mean, it's like using biblical levels of language to describe the destructiveness of the bomb, which seems like they're being pretty candid, right? But even in those first announcements, Truman is comparing this to a conventional mega weapon. This is the equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. And, so the radioactive aspect of it is being downplayed right from the very beginning. And, so at first it's reported, we don't know what it looks like under those roiling mushroom clouds. And but for reporters, who were starting to come in with Allied troops as what we would call today embeds, many of them who were hardened war correspondents were deeply determined to be the first ones to get the real story from the ground on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it just ended up taking quite a bit longer to get the full story out than you would think.
Okay, so first up, we've got that. We've got this is going to end the war. I mean, the context also is important, obviously. It's at the end of 6 years of, global war, terrible human toll, in many countries around the world. So there is understandably a great desire for the war to end. That's kind of clear. So some people you could be forgiven for thinking, well, thank God the war's over. That's it. Now we can move on with our lives. So there's that, but as well as the other things that you're just saying. And then Wilfred Burchett, the Australian journalist, who's obviously long dead now in this country, but is a figure of both renown and controversy. Renown primarily because he was the first person to get to, or the first Western journalist to get to Hiroshima and report about it, and controversy because of his later accusations that he was in fact a communist agent and so on, and wasn't a journalist. So that's a separate controversy. Okay, so he gets there and does a story, the first eyewitness account of the destruction at Hiroshima. It appears in the Daily Express in London on the 6th of September. It's a kind of worldwide scoop. By that stage, the Japanese are in the process of surrendering. The formal ceremony is happening on board the USS Missouri. What do you think about what Burchett's role is in this unfolding story?
Well, he was the second reporter who got in, who had a foreign affiliation, and the first was Lesley Nakashima, who was a reporter who had both American and Japanese citizenship. And he had been based in Japan throughout the duration of the war. He got kind of stranded there, and he ended up renouncing his American citizenship while he was there, just to give himself some protection and protect his family. And he had gotten in pretty quickly after the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. He was looking for his mother, who had been living on the outskirts of the city and had survived. And he filed a report with UP, United Press, that went, again, today we would say it went viral, but then it went, wider. And he reported that the city of 300,000 had been completely decimated, and that there was something really off about the bomb that had been used, and something sinister was killing off blast survivors there. But the interesting thing about the Nakashima report is that he first said that he said that he came away from the city and he was sick, and that he thought he might have inhaled gas from the bomb. So you can see at that point, a lot of the journalists and even the doctors there were thinking in terms of gas, which is a World War I mentality. I mean, they say that World War I was the chemists' war, and that World War II is the physicists' war. But, for somebody like Nakashima and the doctors on the ground in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they didn't know they were in the physicists' war yet. They were still trying to figure out what this experimental weapon had been. So then Wilfred Burchett gets into... Just before we get to Burchett, because I remember now from your book,
Nakashima's report goes wide, as you say, but also when it's run in the New York Times, I think it's run in a censored form, isn't it, or in an edited form, I suppose, to put it more neutrally. But some of the key information about hinting at what is this kind of bomb and what is the damage that it's doing, that's not run in the New York Times, is it?
Yeah, it got an astonishing edit. It got quite a makeover for the New York Times run. And it was, it was a really substantial report, maybe 2,000 words, 2,500 words. But, when you see it in the New York Times, it's like this big. And I think it's on page 4 or 6 or 8.
Yeah.
And
I don't think anyone knows Nakashima now. Like he's completely unknown. Hersey is kind of well known, and Burchett is well known as well. But Nakashima, I think when I read your book, I think that was the first time I'd come across his name that I can recall.
Yeah, he's been weirdly erased by history, but I think, one thing that's really helped resurrect his name a little bit is that UP now it's called UPI, United Press International, released online the full report that he put out. So you can see, the very detailed report that he put out in the I think like the third week afterwards. So I mean, that started to kind of rehab or bring back the the memory of the role that he had played as the first in. I'm sorry, what was the question that we were moving on?
Back to Burchett, in that sense, what Burchett's contribution here?
Oh, well, so Burchett, he's in bed. He's coming in, I believe, with a freighter of Marines. And, he's one of the reporters who really wants to get in on the ground because, early on, reporters are realizing, we're seeing pictures of the mushroom clouds and we're seeing pictures of the landscape devastation. But what we're not hearing is, what it was like, what's the human toll. And, Japanese reports are starting to get out and they're, obviously disturbing as hell. But, whoever is the first Western reporter to get in and to get the story for one of their major, Western news publications is going to have a hell of a story, the scoop of the war. So he gets in and he manages to make his way to Hiroshima. And, the train station down at Hiroshima was a little bit on the outskirts of the city. So it hadn't been totally demolished. And he was able to get there by rail. And he, like Nakashima, finds the city has just been it looks like it's been steamrolled. And, again, he's a hardened war correspondent. He's seen everything by this point, but he's aghast by what he sees. Not because he's not accustomed to seeing rubble and death and carnage, but because it's been done by one bomb. And he sits down and this is important also, he goes to hospitals. There are very few medical buildings that are left standing, but he goes and he sees, it's hard to call them blast survivors because they're barely, surviving. I mean, people who are ravaged by some affliction. And it's a horrific affliction and, pulling no punches. He sits down and he writes a very graphic initial account, which he calls, it's an all caps headline that says, "The Atomic Plague, this is my warning to the world. There's a sinister, quote, disease X that's ravaging blast survivors, and this is what happens to them in the aftermath. This is an experimental weapon. This is the bomb that kills long after it's been detonated." And that he got it to a colleague in Tokyo through Morse code, which was an astonishing revelation or way to get it out. And the London's Daily Express did manage to run it, and it created a furor. I mean, everybody in the world really had wanted to know what it was like under the mushroom clouds, and now they were starting to find out.
And then he goes to a press conference where I think it's Major General Thomas Farrell from the US military. They have a kind of argument at the press conference where he being Farrell basically denies what Burchett has reported, and they have a back and forth. And Burchett, I think, is then taken to hospital because he's not, he's perhaps suffering some effects himself, which I think he writes about in his last autobiography, that he thinks that he had suffered some effects of the radiation himself. But that. So those are kind of key and important facts that come out and are contested, obviously. And I think, from that point of view, it's really important. And then things go kind of quiet, don't they? And doesn't President Truman send a sort of missive around to all of the newspaper editors in the United States to basically say, you need to stop writing about the atomic bomb and its effects?
Well, I mean, two things happen. I mean, yes, the Truman administration, they do send a discreet letter to editors across the country and saying that, this is a security issue. And so anything you're writing on atomic matters and atomic weapons needs to be quietly cleared by us or vetted by us. And, wartime censorship officially ended in the fall of 1945. But, this was an ongoing, agreement of sorts. And, but also, in the first days and weeks after Hiroshima, again, we're getting Japanese reports that first started to, tell reveal information about what the bomb was doing to last survivors, and again, the true nature of the radioactive carnage. And those reports were being picked up by Western reporters in the Pacific, and then also after Burchett's report came out, I mean, there was a scramble to lock down other reports of that kind over in Japan by occupation forces. And so, for instance, we have an American reporter named George Weller who's reporting for the Chicago Daily News. He, in the most astonishing stunt, manages to get into Nagasaki, and he prepared a 30,000 word report that he tried to get past censors in Tokyo. Unfortunately for him, his was actually intercepted and quote unquote lost. So that report did not see the light of day in real time. And by the time Weller's report was intercepted, I mean, occupation authorities realized that they had a real PR problem on their hands, and so they immediately corralled foreign press, all of the foreign reporters, Allied reporters who had been coming in with them and their troops, into what Burchett called a press ghetto in Yokohama, and he's always so reliably colorful in his descriptions. And then the Japanese press had to be dealt with and immediately. And so occupation authorities issued what they called a press code. And, this is what you can cover and this is what you can't cover. I mean, the Japanese weren't even allowed to mention Hiroshima in poetry, much less a press report after a certain point in September. The standard that was given in the press code was, if information was printed that quote unquote disturbs the public tranquility, then it was not runnable. So, enormous efforts were being made to suppress information about the true nature of these weapons, and not also just because they felt that it was a PR disaster in terms of qualifying the moral victory of America and the Allied powers, but also because occupation forces were about to put tens of thousands of Allied troops into the country, including into Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the panic of putting these war veterans into cities that might be toxic with radioactivity. They were the occupation forces were at great pains to downplay that narrative.
Okay, so let's bring in our hero of the hour, so to speak, at this point, John Hersey, who, just to telescope a little bit, I mean, he is by this stage, I think he's about 30 or 31 in late 1945 of 1946. He himself is an experienced war correspondent for Time magazine and also for Life, and he's also a budding novelist. He's written a novel, A Bell for Adano, by this point, which has won the Pulitzer Prize. So it's already at a very young age a very glittering career. And I should say the novel, A Bell for Adano, is about part of the war. It's a war novel. So what's the genesis of the idea to go back to Hiroshima and try and find out what's actually gone on there? Is it his idea, or is it Harold Ross or William Shawn at the New Yorker? Did you establish that, whose idea it was originally?
It's Harold Ross. It's unclear exactly whether it was Hersey or William Shawn, but together, John Hersey and William Shawn of the New Yorker. So it's important to just say that John Hersey, by the time Hiroshima happened, became a free agent. He was no longer the heir apparent to Time Inc., but he was at a crossroads, and he was a freelancer, and so he wanted to write for the New Yorker, and luckily for him, the New Yorker wanted him also. And he was having lunch with William Shawn sometime in late fall of 1945. Hersey was about to go to do an extended reporting trip in Asia, mostly in China, where Hersey had been born. But Shawn and Hersey were talking about Japan and the reporting that had come out of Hiroshima up to that point. Hersey had known since the detonation of the bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki that he was going to write about some version of something relating to what had happened. I mean, he was acutely aware that entrance into the atomic age had changed everything for civilization, whether people realized it right away or not. And what he and Shawn realized is again, they had seen all of the rubble pictures. All of the reporting seemed to do with landscape devastation. 68,000 buildings had been devastated, XYZ. And then, but there was nothing about the human element. Nobody had still done blockbuster reporting in recent months, a major significant follow-up piece to the Burchett and Nakashima reports that detailed what it was like to be, again, on the receiving end of nuclear attack. And, what was this sinister disease X? What is the true nature of these experimental weapons? And so, Harold Ross, who was the head of the New Yorker, I mean, the magazine, it had started as a sophisticated humor magazine, but it had gone heavyweight, to a certain extent during the war. He was extremely determined to make sure that certain what he called atrocity stories were not left untold just because the public was fatigued and wanted to look forward. And so this was one story that they felt, even though it was months later at this point, had gone untold, in that if they didn't get in, if they didn't send Hersey in to try to tell the story, nobody would.
Okay, so he gets in. There's a kind of serendipitous moment when he's on the way over by boat to China, I think first, and then into Japan, where he's sick, and he reads Thornton Wilder's book, The Bridge of San Luis Rey. And later, in hindsight, everybody can see that that's given him his kind of narrative structure, if you like, which is to take an event and write about it from the perspective of the participants in the event. So that's just a little foreshadow there, if you like. But how easy or how difficult was it for him to get clearance to get into Japan and then into Hiroshima, given that, as you said before, there was a great deal of concern on the part of the American military that they needed to actually tightly control access to Japan?
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the most surprising parts of my research, because looking at the story from afar, it has all of the hallmarks of being, a sort of a sneak-in story, right? Like he got in somehow under the noses of the occupation officials, did the reporting and got back out again. And which would make it, a specific kind of investigative journalism. But what I found is that it really ended up being a very particular kind of access journalism for Hersey in the end. So, Hersey, unlike, Burchett and George Weller, he was a hardened war correspondent too. He'd seen everything from combat to concentration camps, for God's sake. And, he had been in various theaters of war since 1939. But he had been, unlike George Weller, for instance, who had been butting heads with MacArthur's censors for years. Hersey had been more of a team player with the U.S. military. Throughout, he had written, positive, profiles of military figures, including John F. Kennedy, who had, was the big PT 109 story was Hersey's, that ran in the New Yorker, that helped make JFK's career. He had written an extremely laudatory biography of General MacArthur, a sort of a mid-war biography of MacArthur and his troops. Hersey later wished that he could take it out of print because it had been, too nice. But at the time when you're applying for clearance to MacArthur's Japan, that's definitely going to be an asset that works in your favor, right? So he's probably seen by occupation officials, by their PRO or their public relations office, as being a more innocuous sort of reporter, a team player, than somebody like Burchett or George Weller. So they give him clearance in, and he is what I call in the book, the perfect Trojan horse reporter in that respect.
Yes, it's a good phrase. So he gets in there, and I think that one of the other striking things from your description at that point is that I think he says that from the moment he arrived in Hiroshima until the moment he left, he felt terrified and horrified by what he was seeing, and he kind of basically wanted to get in and out as fast as he could, which goes to his sort of initial and visceral human response to what he was seeing, which again, I'm just slightly foregrounding or foreshadowing in the sense that one of the things that talked about in the way it's written is that he appears to be detached and so on. But so he does his interviews, he finds people, and one of the things that struck me about that was that the people who he interviewed again, from your book, they say that they remember him being a very good listener, as in he really did capture what they said and the meaning of what they said and so on.
Yeah, I mean, well, that was another big question for me was, how, first of all, did he speak Japanese? How did he interact with them? No, he didn't. He used translators on the ground there. And secondly, how accurate were his portrayals? Because what he did is he interviewed dozens of blast survivors on the ground there, and then he ultimately picked 6 protagonists who were what we would call in America everyday folks. So like a young widow with 3 children, a young female clerk, a young priest, 2 doctors, people who were highly relatable, and so I was. The level of detail about their experiences on August 6, 1945, and the weeks that followed afterwards was so incredible that I wondered, how did he take notes? He couldn't have recorded. There wasn't recording equipment at this time. And then later on, was there a record of how these 6 protagonists felt about Hersey's reporting? Did they feel that it was accurate? Quite a few of them did later, because later they became internationally famous after Hersey's report came out, and several of them stated that they couldn't believe the accuracy with which he had recounted and level of detail that he had recounted their stories. And yes, he was, when he came to Hiroshima, and again, I can't overstate. He had seen horrible devastation throughout the war, but the visceral reaction was overwhelming for him. And don't forget, he came in through Tokyo, which had been decimated, comparably. I think Burchett or one of the other press corps correspondents likened it to an ashtray with cigarette butts sticking out of it. So for him to have the visceral reaction he had to Hiroshima is really quite something. And he is not an embellisher.
No.
And what he said, the thing that so terrified him was, again, just the concept that all of this agony and horrific devastation had been caused by one single, then primitive bomb.
Yeah. Okay. That's a really strong point in that sense. That's one of the unique things, or that is the unique thing about the bomb in that sense. So he does that work. He comes back and he has a choice as to how he's going to write this story. Now, I've mentioned the Bridge of San Luis Rey, which, if you like, is a narrative structure to kind of write about it. And I think he's quoted in your book as saying he wants to write about the effect of the destruction on human beings, not on buildings. But how does he choose to write about it? And then also let's talk about the editing process, which is very significant in the finished article.
He takes each of the accounts of these 6 protagonists, and it starts at the exact moment of the bombing, which is 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945. And he recounts where each person was, a young mother cooking breakfast for her exhausted children. They've all been up with night raids all night. A young minister who is helping, a neighbor bring items out of for safekeeping out of the city, a doctor who is sitting on his porch reading the newspaper, and then at that moment the blinding flash comes, and then what happens to them in the aftermath. And so what he does is he takes the narrative of each only so far, and so that they're cliffhanging throughout, but they're all interwoven. These are all people whose paths, they had known each other before the bomb, and then their paths would cross in many ways in the days and the weeks to follow. And so he is clinical but unsparing in his details of what these people experienced and what they saw. And it's the fact of the clinicalness, whatever the word is for that. It's important because he said that he wanted it to be sort of almost like a very deadpan recitation of facts. And because he said that he felt if he had infused the storytelling with his own sense of rage about it, that it would not only take readers out of the narrative, but it would also just wouldn't have had the same effect that it ultimately had. And it was a very smart decision, but it must have been very difficult to write it in such a deadpan kind of way.
I agree with that entirely, and I do think that that's why I talk about or ask about choices that a writer makes when they're, writing something. It's what one critic has called history's least imaginable event, that is the dropping of the atomic bomb, and he had to find ways to write about it. And he's criticised later by some people, such as Mary McCarthy, the novelist who wrote The Group, for turning it into some kind of standard newspaper human interest story, which I don't agree with. But her kind of point is that in her view, he's made it less unique. And you write about this quite a lot, that one of the things that he's done is to enable people to imagine themselves in the shoes of the 6 Japanese, remembering, they had been the enemy, remembering that they had been the people who had attacked Pearl Harbor back in 1941, which brought the US into the war. And so, imagining that, the term you used before was relatable, which is a kind of current term, but it is true in this sense that that's what people weren't able to do, because the response and to the story is extraordinary, which we'll come to. But just before we do that, the editing process, the New Yorker is famous for its meticulous editing, and Harold Ross, there's a million sort of stories, some of them apocryphal, about the way in which he edited. But it does appear, both from your book and from other accounts, that he and William Shawn added very significantly to the impact of the story by dint of their editing. What did you find there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, Hersey, he took all of his notes and he did all of his reporting, and then he got out of Dodge, because if you're writing the report in Japan and then attempting to wire it back, forget it. So, William Shawn, at one point wires Hersey while he's over, and I can't remember if it was in China or Japan at that point, but said, we think it would be best for you if you wrote it back in New York. So Hersey comes back, he writes the first draft, and then he and Harold Ross and William Shawn essentially go underground in Ross's office. They're locked away in the corner office. Nobody else at the New Yorker, with very few exceptions, knows what's happening. It's basically, their own version of a journalistic Manhattan Project. And, the rest of the staffers are all reportedly kept on working on a dummy issue. I never saw the dummy issue. They're not complete records in the New Yorker records. But I spoke with a lot of veteran New Yorker editors and writers and people who worked in what they called then the makeup department, which is, just literally how the magazine is assembled, the layout and that kind of thing. And they had been told by the original makeup man that everybody else had been kept working on this fake issue. So all these, salty New Yorker contributors are handing in their copy for stories and wondering where the hell are Harold Ross's, nasty comments coming back. Well, he's in the corner office, editing, the bejesus out of this story. And, they were, the New Yorker editors, as you say, are famous for the extreme extent of their editing, of their fact checking. In this case, they took it to the nth degree, because they were really aware of how contentious the story was for so many reasons. I mean, first of all, you're humanizing the Japanese. Everybody's mad at the Japanese, and the feelings of support for Hiroshima and Nagasaki in America were overwhelmingly supportive. And, there was a poll that was taken in August of 1945, where nearly a quarter of the people polled said that they wished that more atomic bombs could have been dropped on Japan before the country had a chance to surrender. So, humanizing the Japanese is going to be controversial, right? And then, second of all, I mean, you're basically taking away part of the moral high ground of this otherwise very pure and righteous victory from the Americans over the last standing Axis power. And third of all, they knew that they were about to show up not only the government and show how much the government had been withholding from the U.S. and from the world about Hiroshima and the nature of their weapons. They were also showing up the other members of the press, because nobody else had bothered to or had been able to successfully, follow up those initial reports. So they are taking excruciating care when they are writing and editing the story, because it would, as Harold Ross later put it, quote, bear the greatest strain of any magazine story ever printed.
Yes. Okay. So they do that, and one one small example of that is that in the edits, Harold Ross says Hersey jumps around in terms of the time that the bomb dropped, and what we need to do is find exactly what time the bomb dropped according to Hersey and stick to it all the way through. And so that's where you get that almost kind of biblical opening at exactly 15 minutes past 8 on the morning of 6th of August and so on.
And but it's biblical, but it's detail also. I mean, that's the thing about it, is that it somehow manages to be so incredibly biblical, but at the same time have the clinicalness of a doctor's report in a way. I mean, so that's the feat of the whole story.
And the other thing I think this is William Shawn's idea, that they decide to devote an entire issue of the magazine for the first time in its history to the one story, like no cartoons, no arch talk of the town sort of pieces or anything like that. And that is again, in hindsight, doesn't seem like much, but that's one of the elements which made the impact. And you tell the story well in the book about how it sold out so quickly and how it became a collector's item in secondhand bookshops within sort of weeks or days. And Albert Einstein orders 1,000 copies because he wants to send it round to all scientists around the world. And it's read on radio overnight. It's, played in the UK and elsewhere. And it makes a huge, huge impact. And including also, which I'd like you to perhaps talk about a little, more letters come into the New Yorker's offices for this particular story than any other, I think, in the magazine's history up to that time, and probably for another 20-odd years. What are those letters saying to the editors about the article?
Well, I mean, we only have what's been saved, and so, they did have enough character to save good and negative letters. And, again, it was never going to be a foregone conclusion that the response was going to be overwhelmingly supportive, which it actually was. But of course, there were people who were incredibly upset about Hersey's reporting. And, this is harrowing. Now go right up Nanking, right about the Philippines, that kind of thing. And so, however, one valuable asset that I had in terms of ascertaining the overall temperament of the responses was there had been a survey. A firm had surveyed the letters that had come into the office and put them into categories of very supportive, mildly supportive, utterly outraged, and then last with this person wants to kill you, and they were overwhelmingly positive, and most people fell into the category of believing that the reporting had been put out there to benefit the common good. It's kind of astonishing to imagine that response had the story been released in a landscape comparable to today's landscape.
Well, indeed. And I want to come to the question of the military's sort of the parallel narrative with the military going on here. Just before that, I need to, if you like, what's your view on my view when I read both the original Hiroshima and rereading it, in the context of your book, is that one of its achievements is that it provides an imaginative space for readers to imagine themselves in the shoes of the bomb victims. It sounds kind of really obvious, but it actually clearly is true. That's one of the things that comes through in the letters. People say, I had no idea, and so on and so on. So, if you like, it's an example of a narrative approach to telling a story that can make. It's the narrative approach that can make a real impact. Obviously, it needs to be done well, but that's one of the things that makes the impact. So, you could make the argument this is an approach to journalism, an approach to narrative that actually has a positive impact in enabling people to see things in a fuller and deeper way, and so on. So that seems to be the evidence from the letters. It's from what you say in your book and so on, and from the piece's enduring kind of legacy. It's still in print, etc. What's happening with the US military as this is going on? In particular, General Lesley Groves, who's the head of the Manhattan Project. Just tell us that story. in brief.
Let me take a deep breath through this one. Groves had been, very involved in the narrative of how the bombs were presented to the world after detonation in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And initially, he was very involved in downplaying, especially the radioactive qualities of the bomb. And at one point, he's hauled in front of Congress in the fall of 1945 to talk about the bombings. And at first, he's outright denying that there was any radioactive element to the bombs. And it's quote unquote Tokyo tales. Any of the press reports that you're hearing coming out of Japan is just the Japanese are trying to create sympathy in the international community to create better wartime surrender terms for themselves. Don't pay attention to them. Nothing to see here. He's even taken reporters on a junket to the site of the Trinity test in New Mexico to show them, I love the idea of like showing people there's no radioactivity. I mean, it's, the invisible enemy, and the reporters are there shuffling around with their white shoe coverings in case there's any radioactive buildup. And Groves is saying, look, you could live here forever. But as time goes on, and this is important. So then gradually he's starting to reveal a little bit more about the experimental weapons, frankly, as the U.S. military is learning more about their weapons. And so when he's, asked in front of Congress, about them, he says, well, yes, there is, people may have taken in some radioactivity, when the bomb went off. But, rest assured, and this is an exact quote, he said, radiation poisoning, I'm told, is a, quote, very pleasant way to die. So, one of the more astonishing utterances, I think, of the era regarding this topic. A year later, however, as needs and policies have evolved, and Hersey and his editors, while they're editing Hiroshima, all of a sudden have an obstacle thrown in front of them that is just a journalist and editor's nightmare. And that is that, President Truman signs into being the Atomic Energy Act. And one of the things that this act has is a quote unquote restricted data standard. And it's, basically covers any information about, the bombs or atomic matters that could be perceived as compromising national security. So, these guys, they're in this quandary, if they're about to publish this account, and Hersey does include quite a bit of scientific information about, the aftermath and the bombing itself. Are they putting themselves in danger of being, considered, a public a security risk? The punishments for being in violation of the Atomic Energy Act were quite severe. So, what do? Do they submit?
Was it years of imprisonment, wasn't it? Or
I mean, look, if they could, if yes, years of imprisonment, fines, but also, if it could be deemed treasonous, there was even the possibility of, punishment by death, which would have been, the extreme example, very hard to show that were, it would have been legally difficult for anybody to demonstrate that the New Yorker had been willfully trying to harm the U.S.'s national security. But if they had been deemed in violation of the act, it would have been, their own horrific PR disaster. So what are they going to do? They've gone completely out of their way, obviously, to evade MacArthur's censors. Wartime censorship is officially over, but there's still sort of this gentleman's agreement between, media platforms and the government that they will submit sensitive materials to the government for vetting. And so they do. They do submit Hiroshima, the draft, to the War Department for vetting, and to none other than Lesley Groves himself. Ultimately, I feel like I'm giving away like one of the biggest blockbuster moments of my own book here, but ultimately he clears it. And when I first found evidence of this, what we called in my team the Groves submission, I was flabbergasted. First of all, I found evidence I found it in the New Yorker archives, a cover letter that William Shawn had included with submitting the draft, and I thought, this can't be what I think it is. This is, the ultimate, this is like the Watergate reporting of its time. How could this have been submitted to the War Department? And then, there was documentation on Lesley Groves's end also.
And that's where you get the his actual what he wanted changed and his clearance, because he does want some things changed, and it's not quite clear what exactly is changed by the editors and what isn't. But what, in summary, what effect do you think his requests for changes had on the finished article?
Well, he gets the draft, and he calls William Shaw and he says, "I'm going to let it go, but I need to make a few little changes," which is like, as an editor, you're just thinking, "Oh my God, what's coming, and what deal am I about to cut with the devil?" Right? And so we don't have a before and after, and because the meeting, it was a meeting that took place. Groves dispatched one of his PR guys up to New York from Washington to meet in the New Yorker offices and discuss the draft. But we do have, early drafts of Hiroshima, and then we have the published draft. And there are certain things that are not in the published draft, which you would, were quite obvious omissions if you were looking at it from Groves's point of view. So, you have in the first drafts, Hersey saying, all of the generals and senators of the U.S. can't cover up what happened in Hiroshima. It's just not going to happen, and that's not.
That doesn't end up in a finished article. So,
no.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. And then also, but curiously, and this leads into why Groves may have approved it. Suddenly there's language about, not only is this the most destructive bomb in human history, but there are more and bigger weapons like this in production. And that's Groves' language. I mean, in Groves' own words, he said, he had gotten to the point a year later where he had determined the most important thing was to convince the American public and, the American leadership that we had to maintain a really powerful nuclear arsenal. What he said was the biggest, the best, and the most, because he's already looking to a time when the U.S. does not have the nuclear monopoly anymore. And he knows he gives the Soviets initially 5 to 20 years to catch up. Well, guess what? It's 4. So 1949. That's only 3 years away at this point. And so, suddenly there's this language, that appears in Hiroshima. It's almost like an advertisement in a way, a subversive advertisement for the U.S.'s nuclear arsenal building prowess.
Well, that's quite an arc he's gone on, isn't it? Between sort of 1945 and the trials, if you like, and then about a bit over a year later when he's seeing, in a sense, and this is kind of implied, if you like, we are we're gleaning it from what he said and from the documents and so on, that there's an element in which the publication of Hersey's Hiroshima suits his agenda by the middle of 1946. And so to me, this is one of the most kind of interesting, fascinating, disturbing, all sorts of things, moments, in the sense that you have, on the one hand, an article which has an extraordinary impact in terms of awakening people's sympathies to what has happened and their genuine alarm about the impact of an atomic bomb, on the one hand. And on the other hand, that's exactly what Lesley Grove wants them to feel, so that they will be perhaps frightened. It'll warn the enemy. It says to the enemy, the Soviets, we've got the weapon, and it's, we're working on bigger and even nastier versions of it. What do you make of that sort of conflict, that weird confluence of events and influences?
Well, I mean, it took me a long time to unpack all of that, I do a lot of consulting, and luckily I was able to speak at length with one of Groves's biographers who just knows him inside out, and we spent hours kind of parsing that and parsing Groves's mentality. Because when I first found out about the submission and then the green lighting by Groves, I was like, how I can't understand this. He was one of the primary architects of cover-up initially. How would we get to this point? And then you just, you realize, people's objectives change, and they change quickly. And, as you say, this is mostly gleaned from, the minimal materials that we have about the decision-making surrounding the green lighting. But I mean, it is an extremely cynical use of Hiroshima, because, John Hersey's whole approach, the point of it, of that reporting, was to create a sense of almost agonizing empathy in his readers. That this is what it's like to be a human being under nuclear attack. And, for him, it's about abolition of nuclear weapons. This can't be allowed to happen again. Well, for Groves, that empathy, that people being like, oh my God, this could be New York, or this could be Toledo, Ohio, or this could be San Francisco. That has a utility to him because in his mind, if people are afraid that they are next, of course they're going to see the need to maintain nuclear superiority. And so it really did have, again, as we said, that cynical utility. And, even Hersey and his editors were aware of the message that something like Hersey's Hiroshima would send to the Soviets, who were by then very much, a emerging adversary for the U.S. And, they knew that something like that would be seen as what they even called themselves, a propagandistic threat. We have this, you don't. And the Soviets already felt extremely threatened by the U.S.'s nuclear monopoly. And so from somebody like Groves's point of view, or the U.S. military's point of view, having something like this in the world that not only may inadvertently drum up support for a bigger nuclear arsenal, but also scare the hell out of the Soviets or intimidate them. That's not exactly a bad tool to have in one's bag.
Yeah. Does that mean though that you would have preferred that they didn't publish the article in the first place? Would you not take it that far?
Oh no. I think that honestly, the Hersey's intentions for the article bore far more fruit than Groves's utility for it. I mean, Hersey's Hiroshima has been the pillar of deterrence, or at least he certainly saw it that way, for 75 years. I mean, in Hersey's mind, he said, quote, the thing that has kept the world safe from nuclear attack in the last 75 years is the memory of what happened in Hiroshima. Well, he's the first person who revealed to the world what happened in Hiroshima. The Japanese couldn't speak for themselves until after the occupation was over, years later. So whatever utility Groves felt that the article may have, Hersey's intentions far outweighed the sort worse, in my opinion.
Yeah, sure. And I think you use that quote from Hersey as an epigraph at the beginning of the book. And he has that view, as you've said. Do you, to what extent do you agree with that? Do you think that is a reasonable thing to be saying now, in 2020, when we look back on the impact of the article, or what else is at play, do you think, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, look, from the experts in the nuclear field, whether it's people who've been in positions of leadership or people at the Bulletin for Atomic Scientists, or experts seem to believe that it has acted as a deterrent, and that it has been an important element, and it's also been a very motivating factor for many leaders up to this era. To many people who are peace advocates or have been, somebody like William Perry. I mean, they state that Hersey's Hiroshima, was one of the first things that acquainted them with the perils of nuclear war, and was a highly motivating factor for them to go into a particular kind of leadership. So, I mean, it's been deeply effective in many different ways. However, even by the 1980s, Hersey himself is getting worried that the memory of Hiroshima, as he has helped paint it, was growing dim. And what happens when the memory grows dim? Does it lose its potency as a deterrent? And I think that's a very reasonable.
Yes, very reasonable. He does a kind of a long afterward, in around about 1985 from memory, where he goes back and he tracks what's happened to each of the six people that he wrote about in the original narrative. And that's, if you buy it today, that's what you get. You get the original 31,000 word article plus the long kind of afterward. But okay, look, I think that is a good place actually to end it, because I think we've brought it up to the present, and your opinion about its enduring value is clear. So, Lesley Blume, thank you very much for your time today to talk about your book, which I will hold up. It's called Fallout, and it came out just a few weeks ago. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for your read and for having me on.